Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to talk about Logic Apps and Power Automate differences. This is part 2 of the series that I started last week, and today we're going to focus on connectors. So once again, a reminder, and I'll probably include this in every video just so the message doesn't get changed, but really there is no winner here. That's not the intent of this specific series. It's not a versus conversation. It is more of a education series, and the goal there is just to help educate customers on the differences that allows them to go ahead and then bring their requirements forward, and then naturally being able to choose what is the right technology for them. Prior to joining Microsoft, I've used both of these technologies. I think there's a place for both of these technologies, and this isn't about one versus the other. So I want to make sure that message is clear. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about this specific episode itself. Now, this topic has a lot of nuances, connectors that is. And so in some ways, when I was putting together the session, it was almost more of what are the differences between Logic Apps Standard and Logic Apps Consumption / Power Automate, because there's so many similarities with Logic Apps Consumption and Power Automate. There's more similarities there than there are differences between Logic Apps Standard and Logic Apps Consumption. So for the first part of this content, it'll be a little bit skewed to Logic Apps, and really that's just to help educate on the differences between Standard and Consumption. And then towards the end of the presentation, then we'll get back into that table that you saw previously, where I'll compare and contrast some of the differences between the two itself. Now, some of the differences that we will see across the different services come down to first-party integration, and I think that's pretty cool. Naturally, Power Automate's part of the Power Platform, so there's going to be some synergy there. When we think about Logic Apps, it's part of Azure Integration Services, and so there's some synergy there with other Azure services like API Management and Azure Functions as an example. We will talk about Logic Apps Standard and how there's built-in connectors, which are quite different than Azure or what's known as managed connectors that we find in Logic Apps Consumption, as I alluded to before. And then also I just wanted to make sure it's clear that when we think about Logic Apps Standard, you can also use the Azure connectors as well in Standard. It's not just like one or the other. So let's go ahead, let's dive deeper into this topic and see where it goes. Okay, so to start with, we need to go over a specific concept, and that concept is the type of connectors. So built-in versus Azure or managed. You might see those terms being used interchangeably. So when we think about built-in, and this is specific to Logic Apps, we've got a single tenant architecture. So your connectors are going to run inside of your compute, and naturally this compute can be scaled up or out based upon your needs. Generally what this means is that you should receive better performance because you have more control over it. And obviously if you're going to be integrating with another endpoint and you own that endpoint and you're also using a premium SKU, you can expect better performance end to end. So for example, if you're on Logic Apps Standard and you have a high throughput messaging scenario with, say, Azure Service Bus, and you're using the premium SKU of Azure Service Bus, naturally you can go ahead and sort of tune those services to meet your needs because you own both ends of the pipe. And so as a result, you can achieve better performance generally. Now, if we think about the built-in connectors that exist today, most of the time, or generally speaking, they're protocol related. So we've obviously got Azure Messaging. We could have FTP. We could have File. We could have SFTP. We have HTTP. We also have MQ Series as well. So these typically are message-oriented type scenarios where you're going to have high throughput and you're going to be using sort of one of these traditional protocols around it. Now, naturally, where it makes sense, we've got support for Azure services, but we also have like that IBM example as well. So generally high volume, you're not metered per action because you're provisioning a workflow service plan as a result. And so these are running inside of your workflow service plan. If you have high throughput needs, then you need to scale up or out. As a result, you'll pay more for that scale capability. And then lastly, a big benefit of built-in is you can easily connect to a VNet, and that's one of the popular use cases for using standard. Now, if we think about Azure or managed, I've got both Logic Apps and Power Automate logos here for good reason. Here's where we see a lot of similarities with this particular connectors. This is generally shared infrastructure and how these are used, and naturally there's going to be a few other options or nuances related to that. Now, when we think about these connectors generally have been around longer than built-in. As a result, they have like more maturity, and I don't mean that they're more reliable. What I just mean is like there's been more chances to sort of enhance them, and enhancements can come through, say, authorization or authentication options. So if you go into consumption, you might find that, oh, this supports managed identity, or this supports service principal, or this supports, say Windows authentication when it comes to some connectors that use gateways. You might not find all of those options are there for built-in. We're generally trying to close that gap. I think even more recently, say Key Vault now supports managed identity from a built-in, and so that is something where we're trying to achieve parity, but just naturally there's been more time for those features to be enabled on the Azure side of things. Now, with Azure being a multi-tenant architecture, there's naturally going to be throttling imposed so that you don't have noisy neighbor type situations, and as a result you've got a predictable experience for all customers. And so that's kind of one of the key differences here. Now, as a result, these are going to be transactions that are metered, and this is in Logic Apps, so kind of the more you use of it, the more you'll pay. As a result, if you don't use it, it's multi-tenant, it's cloud economics, you're not going to pay as a result, but the capability is there. So kind of has to align with sort of your needs as a customer. Now, if you think about Power Automate, that's where we've got generally more user-centric licensing, and so that metered per action doesn't apply there. Now, if you want to access on-prem, generally you're going to go ahead and do that through the gateway. And so you've got sort of a set of connectors that allows you to then go ahead and bridge the on-premise network through a gateway, and you can go ahead and call them from Power Automate or Logic Apps consumption. So this is inside of Logic Apps. This is kind of an example of what you would see if you kind of compare and contrast built-in versus Azure. So built-in, you can see a lot of those connectors or scenarios I talked about before. And so you've got your IBM, you've got event hubs, you've got messaging, SFTP, HTTP, FTP, Cosmos DB, Azure Functions. So generally scenarios where you might need some additional throughput needs. You'll also see we've got built-in actions. So things like our inline code, our date time, our compose actions, those are all considered built-in as well. And so you won't be metered for those inside of our Logic App standard environment. Now, if we flip over to the Azure side of things, right, this is where you're going to see the remaining connectors, those connectors that are part of the consumption plan. So if you need to go ahead and call the ServiceNow or Office 365, you're going to find them in this specific tab itself. Now, even if you provision Logic App Standard, you can still use these Azure connectors, because obviously we've got around 30 over here, and we've got 800 plus on the other side of things. Okay, and we're still talking about Logic App Standard and built-ins, and here we've got a Logic App Standard instance. We're on the networking blade, and what we've got here is VNet integration that's been set up, and that will allow me to go ahead and connect to a VNet inside of Azure. This VNet naturally can be paired to on-premise networks, and as a result, that's where you get that bridge into your on-premise resources. And when you establish your VNet configuration and you enable route all of your traffic will be routed through this basically network path. Now, this pertains to the built-in connectors. If you are using basically the Azure connectors, those are still going to live and be hosted in the public internet. You're just going to access those connectors through your VNet route, as opposed to directly going to the internet from your instance itself. But those sit outside of your VNet, so just wanted to make sure that's clear. That question comes up a fair bit. Now, pricing model, and this is once again still on the Logic Apps. I just want to illustrate the difference between standard and consumption. Here we've got essentially a workflow service plan or an app service plan. And so we've got three different types or SKUs, WS1, WS2, WS3. This is the smallest, WS3 will be the largest. You pay for this per hour, and as a result you get sort of a monthly charge. Now all of your built-in actions can run within this plan and you won't be charged any additional money. Now if you do want to use those Azure or managed connectors, that's where you still have a per execution transaction where you will go ahead and add to this number itself. Now if you're in consumption world, you're going to be paying that just the per action. There's no such thing as built-in. You don't have a service plan. Naturally there is some data retention you have to take care of, but otherwise the more you use, the more you pay. If you're not using that much, you're not going to pay that much. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about Power Automate and Logic Apps since we've got some of that theoretical stuff out of the way. So let's start with Power Automate, and what they have is some unique offerings that are largely related to Power Platform, which makes perfect sense since it's part of that family. So one of those being AI Builder. So if you want to be able to go ahead and use AI to intelligently parse PDF documents, extract key details, and then use it downstream in your Cloudflow, you can certainly go ahead and do that using that connector. We've got RPA, robotic process automation capabilities enabled through the Desktop Flows connector. We also have Power Virtual Agents, PVA, and Power Apps, triggers and actions. And so this is quite useful when you're in those tools and you need extensibility to Power Automate. So you might have a chatbot. I want to go ahead and do some lookup. I can easily go ahead and create a Cloudflow that'll go ahead and do that. Same thing with Power Apps. Maybe you need to do some sort of enrichment. You need to access some additional data sources. You pair up a Cloudflow with a Power App and it becomes a pretty compelling solution. Next up, SAP. So Microsoft within the last year acquired a company called Clear Software that specializes in building integrations for SAP. And so this was something that was released, I believe, recently at the Power Platform Conference in September in Orlando. So I haven't had a chance to try this just yet, but for now, at least, this is only available inside of Power Automate. Now, when we think about Power Automate, connectors are generally grouped into two different capabilities or offerings. So we've got standard connectors and premium connectors. Generally, and I use the term generally loosely, is that these do come back to user-based licensing. So for example, you've got M365, and as a result of M365, you have access to Cloudflows, and you can go ahead and automate your Office workflows using those connectors, no additional charges. But if you need to take advantage of some of these other capabilities like RPA, or perhaps some third-party SaaS connectors like ServiceNow, or even HTTP or custom connectors, generally there's an impact on licensing from that perspective. Now, we do have a couple of mechanisms that we can use inside of Power Automate to sort of deal with this. Per flow licensing is one of those things where it's more suited for large volume scenarios where you might have many users that need to go ahead and say call this flow. Maybe it's a manual trigger, and as a result you don't want to have every one of those users to have a license to go ahead and use that particular flow because it's got premium connectors. Well, what you can do is basically get per flow licensing, which allows everyone in your organization to go ahead and use it if they so wish. Another thing I don't have here on the list, but it is relatively new, pay-as-you-go is another model that you could look at as well if you wanted to see about using those premium connectors and having it metered on more of a per flow basis, not a per action basis. Flipping over to Logic Apps, with Logic Apps being part of the Azure Integration Services family, kind of like the Power Platform, but for integration. We've got some unique offerings as well. So Azure API Management Connector, the ability to go ahead and call an API easily from a workflow is there. There's also the flip side of that, where inside of Azure API Management, you can go ahead and protect a consumption-based Logic app, and there's a wizard that allows you to easily go ahead and wire that up. Azure Functions, there's a connector there. If we want to go ahead and call an Azure function from a first-class way, we can go ahead and easily enumerate the functions that we have access to in our subscription and then be able to go ahead and call it up and wire it out. Now, if we talk about the IBM side of things and even SAP, these are part of the premium or the enterprise connector suite that's available inside of Logic Apps. We'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But if we think about, these are generally those message-based oriented type connectors where you generally need to do some large data transformations beforehand, and you're then going to go ahead and send these messages through, in some cases, a high throughput scenario as well. This is a scenario where you wouldn't be using your traditional action card where you're going to populate all of these individual attributes. You're generally going to go ahead and send in, say, lines and lines and lines of records, and as a result, you've got some more sort of complex use cases there. Inline code is another thing that's unique to Logic Apps. This allows you to go ahead and write some JavaScript inside of your workflow. These are meant to be short-lived, generally 5 seconds or less, but allow you to do things like simple calculations, some message shaping, even some regular expression type functionality. And so this just avoids you having to, say, provision an Azure function if you just want to write a few lines of code. And so that's an offering available. Now, if we think about consumption-based pricing, especially with the Azure connectors, these are as a result tied to a resource, not to a user. Because you pay every time it runs, it kind of doesn't matter if it's 10 users that are calling it or using that connector, if it's still being called 100 times total, right? So you'll get billed for the 100 times total, and it doesn't matter who's using it as a result. So just a different way it is metered and licensed. Then we've got built-in, similar idea in the sense that you've already provisioned some sort of like workflow service plan. You know, it doesn't matter if there's 5 developers working in that Logic app or if there's, 1, you're still going to pay for that service plan. And as a result, like that's how you're metered. You're not metered individually. Want to take this opportunity just to explain some of the terminology as well, because this can sometimes be confusing as well. So if we think about Power Automate, I've talked already about standard, right? We've got standard connectors. These are generally going to be offered through your M365 subscription and are intended to go ahead and automate your Office 365 workloads. Premium, this is where we start to get into some of those third-party SaaS connectors, your Salesforce, your ServiceNow, Adobe, and then we've got even first-party things like SQL Server and even HTTP. And so these do require that premium license. Now, if you think about Logic Apps, it's a little bit different, once again, based on that model. So if we think about what's considered standard connectors in Logic Apps, you're going to see those connectors like SQL Server and like ServiceNow and Adobe and SQL Server being part of the standard. Once again, like you're being metered, so it doesn't really matter if it's like a Office 365 Outlook email action being called or a SQL Server action being called. You're still being metered the same way. Now the enterprise, there's just a few connectors here: SAP, MQ, IBM 3270, and these were parts of sort of, I guess, a different model, especially if there's something called ICE, Integration Service Environment, where you would get some entitlement around these. And as a result, these were bucketed differently and at one point were metered differently as well. Although looking at the pricing calculator, it looks like they're now the same cost. But these are what's considered enterprise. Sometimes people sort of think premium in Power Automate means enterprise in Logic Apps, which isn't quite the case. But just thought I would explain this sort of nuance here. All right, let's talk a little bit about custom connectors. Generally, the experience and capabilities are similar. One exception that comes to mind is within Power Automate, there is a custom code feature as part of a custom connector, which allows you to do some additional enrichment before or after the underlying API call has been made. That's not something that's available in Logic Apps today. And so that is unique to Power Automate. It is actually quite useful. It's a pretty cool feature. Now, if we think about the independent publisher program, this is something that is shared in terms of the connectors that are available. If someone publishes their connector as independent publisher, you should be able to find it in Power Automate and Logic Apps. Now, one nuance is that Logic Apps does consider custom connector a standard connector. So once again, you would get metered per action, versus on the Power Automate side of things, it is considered premium connector. And so that goes back to how you would want to license it from that perspective. All right, so thanks for checking out another video in the series. We've had some good feedback. There's been a lot of engagement around these videos, so definitely appreciate that. And I will continue on with another one in the upcoming week. Thanks. Take care.